Just to introduce myself, my name is Paul Bishop. I am a coordinator on the Journeys to Active Citizenship project at OCASI, and I will hand it over to my colleague Safeeya, who's going to get us started with just an introduction to the project and a land acknowledgement. So Safeeya, take it away.
Thanks, Paul. Hi, everybody. So nice to see you. It's so great to be in meeting view because we get to see who's in the room and see your faces. So before we get into the session, we want to start with the land acknowledgement. We know that many of you are joining the session from different parts of the province and also outside of the province as well. Myself, along with the other lead partners on the Journeys to Active Citizenship project, are based in Toronto, which sits on the traditional territories of the Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and the Anishinaabe, including the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. Regardless of where you're located, many of us have come here as settlers, as immigrants, as newcomers in this generation or in generations past. Some of us came to this land voluntarily, and others came here forcibly, particularly as a result of the transatlantic slave trade. Therefore, we honor and pay tribute also to those of African origin and descent. Land acknowledgements and the work of Truth and Reconciliation invite us to reflect on our personal stories, how we ended up on colonized land, and what our responsibilities are to educate ourselves about the true history of our country and what we can learn and do differently moving forward. The Journeys to Active Citizenship project that brings us all here together wishes to acknowledge the interconnection between Indigenous peoples and immigrants and refugees, as well as with all Canadians, and the critical and valuable role that newcomers play in taking on shared responsibility for caring for this land. So I'll spend a couple minutes just setting a little bit of context and telling you about the project and why we're having this conversation. As you know, this conversation is part of the Journeys to Active Citizenship project, which is a collaboration between North York Community House, who leads the project, OCASI, and the Toronto Metropolitan University's Democratic Engagement Exchange. And so we'll pop our website in the chat. You can read all about the project. I won't go through all of it right now. But one thing that we are talking about a lot recently has been diversity in politics and how representation plays into the role of elections and who gets elected. So although Canada is an incredibly diverse country, our politics often are not. Despite huge demographic changes in recent decades, our politics disproportionately remains white and male in a lot of spaces. So for example, in Toronto, a city where 52% of the population is racialized, which by the way, that 52% number is from 2016, which is a very long time ago. So when we get the results of the new census, it's probably going to be significantly higher is what I think. So despite the 52% racialized population in the city of Toronto, we elected in 2018 just 4 councillors out of 25 who are racialized. Interestingly, depending on how you count it, there's the same number of Mikes and Michaels on Toronto City Council. So out of 25, there's 2 Mikes and there's 2 Michaels, which is 4 Mikes and Michaels, and there's 4 racialized, 3 or 4, depending on how you count it, racialized councillors. So that's some food for thought. There's many barriers to entry, which we're going to get into today. CBC Radio in 2021 found that white men who ran federally in 2015 and in 2019 were better supported financially and ran in easier to win ridings, whereas more diverse candidates had a lot of experiences of racism and discrimination and experienced a lot of barriers on the campaign trail. There's also been studies done that show that at the nomination level, there's a lot of diversity, but when the nomination races are decided and candidates are eventually elected, the pool of diversity goes down quite significantly. All of this has huge consequences. We risk having representatives who, perhaps not intentionally, but disproportionately prioritize the interests of their own groups at the expense of others. We also leave a generation of young people without role models who they can identify with. So today we want to hear from two voices that have found a way for themselves in political activism despite the barriers that they have faced as racialized women. We'll hear about the barriers that they faced and the ongoing work of overcoming them and some of their stories from the front lines. We'll also finish the session with a moderated discussion followed by a Q&A from participants, and you can use the chat for that Q&A. So we're currently in meeting mode as opposed to webinar mode on Zoom. And so we ask that you remain muted throughout to prevent any background noise. And if you want to ask a question during the Q&A, just type it into the chat and we will read it out to you during the Q&A portion. So with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Paul, who will introduce our exciting speakers and moderate today's discussion.
Great, thank you, Safeeya, for that introduction. We're so excited to be joined by two wonderful guests today, Safeeya Faruqui and Habon Ali. I'll introduce both of them before we begin with their presentation. So Safeeya Faruqui is deeply passionate about community. This is translated into both local and national work. In her local community, she worked for a member of parliament in Mississauga and later ran for municipal office in 2018 at 24 years old. Nationally, she's worked for the Canadian Climate Institute and the Canadian Muslim Vote, working on big pictures like Canadian climate policy and civic engagement. She studied at Wilfrid Laurier University and is currently working in the private sector in technology for water conservation. So welcome, Safeeya. Habon Ali. Habon Ali is a systems thinker who has been recognized as Canada's top 100 most powerful women in 2021. She holds an MSc in global health from McMaster University, and graduated as valedictorian of the University of Toronto with an honors Bachelor of Science. Currently, she is recently named Schwarzman Scholar and is attending Tsinghua University in Beijing to study global affairs. So Habon is joining us from Beijing today. Habon advised Prime Minister Justin Trudeau for over 2 years while creating Canada's first national youth policy. She furthered social innovation project at Mars Discovery District and Grand Challenges Canada. Currently, Habon is the chair of the board of directors at Apathy is Boring. She also works with the Future of Canada project, which provides seed funding to catalyze research that explores the possibilities for Canada in the next decade. She's passionate about removing systemic barriers for youth, especially youth from communities who were made to be marginalized and vulnerable. So excited to have these wonderful guests with us today, and we'll begin with their presentations, starting with Safeeya. So Safeeya, take it away.
Hi everyone. Nice to meet you. My name is Safeeya Faruqui. I am so excited to be here. I'd love to share with you my story. So I was raised in Mississauga, with traditional territory, Mississauga of First Nations, and I was really passionate about community from an early age. I come from a family with a really, really strong mother. And so I think that inspired me to want to create positive change because she does that. And so I got involved in politics at an early age. When it started in high school, writing letters to my member of parliament. And I felt at a young age that I could do more with my voice. And so it started with Palestine. I was organizing protests and creating some advocacy around Palestinian human rights, which later led to working for the local member of parliament. So basically, I started off in a political journey and worked in various nonprofits. All of this led to an amazing effort from young people in my community in Mississauga when we got to create a campaign. And it started as a whistleblowing campaign. You know, in my community, there were a lot of barriers that people were facing. There was a 7-year wait list for affordable housing. There were people who couldn't afford, transit, like costs of living were just really expensive. There was also a lot of discrepancy with some of the municipal elected officials, and we wanted some more we wanted some more transparency, which is why we wanted an ombudsman for financial transparency. Those are all things that we were advocating for. And so, in 2018, you had 6 or 7 young people under the age of 30 who got together in a room and decided we were going to put a platform together that we felt would benefit our community, based on many conversations we've had in our community through nonprofits, through some of the work that I did with civic engagement, with the Canadian Muslim Vote, as well as my experience working for the local member of parliament. And so that platform that was all created by young people ended up getting picked up, and all of a sudden we were trending on Twitter and Al Jazeera and CBC and Now This, and it was this amazing whirlwind. And all of a sudden we decided, okay, now it's a time to take this very seriously. So it was, to say the least, a huge learning experience, because we didn't really know what we were doing. And when it comes to politics at the municipal level, you don't have these big machines like the Liberal Party or Conservative Party or NDP or whoever helping you out. So it's a question I ask myself: is it a good thing at the municipal level to be running individually, or does that machine help you? And these are questions that I feel like are really important to ask. And at the time, doing this alone, just going out there and saying, okay, we're going to be doing this. I mean, you learn so much about who the players are. And for me, it's so nice to be part of this conversation with OCASI, because organizations like this are such a helpful tool to young candidates, to give them not only a platform, but also to share, to information share, to knowledge share. So yeah, my experience running for office was wonderful. There were around 400 young people who got involved in some capacity, which is absolutely insane, to see that many young people be involved at the local level. It'd never been like that before in Mississauga. I was the first, if I were to be elected, would have been the first woman of color to be elected on Mississauga's municipal council, which many of you know is a very diverse community. It's around 60% visible minority and racialized people. So it was a 4 or 5 month process. And coming out of it, my takeaways were that there were 3 main takeaways. One is that it's so important to have the resources to be able to run a campaign like this. And often when there are players in the game that really do want to help their communities, they're often the biggest barriers are those financial resources, people resources. Luckily we had the people, but I mean, financially, a lot of the big organizations that donate, that donate either their time or their money, for example, unions and various groups, they traditionally like to align with the current incumbents, because it benefits them, right? They want to create that relationship and maintain that relationship, because at the municipal level, the likelihood of you defeating an incumbent is very, very low. At the municipal level, once you get elected, it kind of is your seat unless you don't want it anymore. And I think that this is starting to change, which is really awesome. And seeing young people and racialized people all over Canada question the status quo has been really inspiring to me. So it's great. Like in Mississauga, for example, this election, 4 years later, we have a series of young people who are running, and it's so wonderful to see young people across the board in Canada running. And to me, that is a win, is already, like, our campaign wasn't successful in the end, but a lot of the platform that we put together has now been implemented into policy. There are so many young people who are now running for office, and that gives me so much hope and excitement. But it's really important I'm excited for this moderated discussion to talk about a lot of the barriers and what we can do as a community and as organizations to improve our societies.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Safeeya. It's wonderful to hear, such an inspiring story of a young person who's really taken matters into their own hands when it comes to politics, right? I think often in politics, especially if you're young, right, there's a sense of disempowerment and what can I do to change things, and it's so challenging to actually make a difference. But so inspiring to see that you and this community that you worked with was able to do that. And I love that you made the point that even if the run did not result in a win, right, it was successful because you created a huge group of young people that felt empowered to make change even when the odds were stacked against you. And so inspiring to hear about the long-term results of your run, right? How many young people are running for city council today that likely were inspired by your story. So wonderful to see those long-term effects that your run had. So thank you. I will turn it over to Habon now. Habon, please take it away.
Thank you so much. And Safeeya, I love your story. I followed your campaign closely. It was such a bright light. And it really made me excited. I didn't know you before then, but I'm happy to know you as a friend now. And I'm so proud of all that you've done, and just know that you've inspired people with your run and the work that you do then and now. So thank you. I really appreciate you. And like Safeeya, I do want to share my story because I think it paints some of my involvement in federal and provincial politics. And then I will touch on some of the barriers and solutions that I can see for the municipal level. So my parents came to Canada in the early 90s from Somalia. I have 3 brothers and 3 sisters, and my youngest brother was born when I was 14. He lives with a rare genetic disorder, and he spent the first few years of his life in and out of Sick Kids Hospital. And this is where my curiosity for the sciences and advocacy actually began. And I was really astounded by some of the experiences that my parents had in the healthcare system here in Toronto. Well, I'm not here now, but when I was home, and their presence was often met with a very dismissive attitude. My mom was questioned on her competence and received really condescending remarks, despite her being an early childhood educator and having raised 6 kids prior to my youngest brother. And this infuriated me, and I quickly realized that racialized and immigrant populations differed in their levels of access to healthcare. I was born and raised in Rexdale. Shout out to Rexdale, a very vibrant, lively, and diverse neighborhood in Toronto. But due to poverty and systemic racism, there are quite a few challenges and realities for youth and children in our communities that are rooted in, underemployment and gun violence as well. And we've prayed more funerals for young people in our community than we have elderly. And my upbringings and realities really shape my worldviews and my motivations and a lot of the things that I'm doing right now. And the very insidious ways that systemic racism manifests throughout our institutions, including education, healthcare, and our justice system, was very clear throughout my childhood. But even with this immense pain and loss, our communities are so much more than our social barriers. And it's quite unfortunate that even in Canada, the color of your skin and your postal code can determine your life expectancy, your quality of life, and your well-being. So seeing my loved ones, friends, and community members not being able to live out the full potential of their lives is really what sparked my interest in the sciences, innovation, government, and health equity. So I volunteered a lot with Toronto Public Health while I was 16, and with organizations like the Mosaic Institute throughout high school and my undergraduate experience. And in university, I conducted a lot of research on accessing healthcare for immigrant, racialized, and newcomer communities throughout the country. And like Paul mentioned, I advised our Prime Minister and his cabinet and the Government of Canada for over 2 years. And during this, I had the really unique opportunity to travel all over the country while we were creating Canada's first national youth policy. And this was the first time seeing Canada for myself outside of Toronto and Ontario. And alongside this wonderful group of young people, we went all over the country to Iqaluit, Sherbrooke, to Toronto. And this experience was really eye-opening, but it showed how it underscored the experiences of many Black, Indigenous, and lower income youth and the very different reality of Canada that we were experiencing. And I was able to engage directly with key decision makers, think about policy at a systems level while being involved in the community at a grassroots level. However, it was really frustrating because these engagements felt very siloed and no one was communicating or collaborating to meet the massive challenges of poverty, violence, and opportunity gap, which blocked youth futures. So it was really a frustrating experience as much as it was educational and eye-opening, especially because I could relate to a lot of the lived experiences of the youth that I was speaking to. And in the past year, I completed a nonpartisan internship with the Ontario Legislature internship program. And I worked for 10 months at Queen's Park with a government MPP and for the other half with an opposition. And I was writing speeches, preparing them for question period, committee work, researching policy issues, assisting them with their constituency work, and attending meetings. And we also really got the chance to do a comparative study tour in different cities, including Ottawa, Quebec, Yellowknife, and London, England. So I'm very privileged to have these political experiences. And I understand that this is not the experiences of all youth, especially youth from my communities, but this is where I received the knowledge based on like the recommendations that I'm going to give now. And when I think about the barriers that marginalized communities experience, specifically what comes to mind is the experiences of Black women from low-income communities, because that's the one I can relate to the most. And when we look at statistics, you know, worldwide, women are less likely to be chief political executives, presidents, prime ministers, premiers, and this pattern holds true in Canada, despite recent advancements that have been made on the federal and provincial level. You know, women typically comprise, you know, less than 1/3 of the cabinet ministers at any level of government, and in municipal politics, women are less likely to be mayors than men. And I think when we're talking about municipalities, it's really important because I believe that they play such a critical role, probably one of the most important government levels that exists. We're talking about housing, transit, health, police services, education, roads, garbage collection, everything that impacts our day-to-day lives. And one thing that I've yet to see be taken seriously is intersectional feminism in our politics. And the COVID-19 pandemic really showed that, you know, we're experiencing a different reality, especially Black communities across the city. As a matter of fact, it just showed us how deeply divided our society is and exposed the depth of inequality as well. However, there's often the invisibility of race in gender discussions, especially when it comes to feminism. We cheer on as we see women break glass ceilings, as they join boards and spaces and professions that are historically exclusive, but oftentimes those women don't look like me. And white feminism tends to exclude Black women and centers the experiences of predominantly white, upper middle class academic women. And that definition in turn informs the policies, practices, and the outcomes that don't include women from my communities and impact their livelihoods and their life trajectory. So going back to the story of my younger brother, my parents navigated that experience together. My mother experienced systemic racism, sexism, and xenophobia, and her story is not unique. In this city, in the city of Toronto, Black women and girls face harm at the hands of people who are supposed to ensure their health and well-being, the educators who are supposed to construct meaningful learning experiences for their lives, organizations that overlook them, underpay them, and push them outside of the workplace, and justice systems that criminalize them and rob them of their innocence in childhood. So I really think we really need to take a deeper look at feminism, and feminism without acknowledging race or class, amongst many other intersectionalities, is useless. So I strongly believe that's something that we can do in our communities and organizations that are supporting candidates, but also just something that we need to reflect on when we're considering our politics. And when I think about barriers that I've experienced in my political work, I've been a young person through the majority of the time that I was experiencing a lot of these political positions. I was between the ages of 16 to 22. And an organization that I really respect that I've had the chance to support in recent years is Apathy is Boring. If you have not heard of them, I encourage you to check out their work. It's a nonpartisan charitable organization that supports and educates young people to be active and contributing citizens to Canada's democracy. And they released a report titled Together We Rise. And this is where a lot of my recommendation comes from, because in reading this report, it really gave me the language to some of the experiences that I had going through the political system. And one barrier is definitely tokenism. You know, oftentimes we create a space for not only young people, but folks from other marginalized communities to share their voice, to participate in the political process. But this often results in disrespectful and tokenistic methods of inclusion that end up alienating the people that we're ultimately trying to include. So I think we really need to consider that the way we approach communities, the way we seek input from people and make sure that we're doing them in meaningful ways. And, you know, one thing is that while we were going through this experience, young people participate in good faith, they share painful experiences. And when they don't see their input being realized into action, you know, it can really feel you leaving disempowered, but it can also turn them away from being active and engaged adults in the civic process. So we really need to consider the impact that our actions has, especially if you're in a position of power, if you're an educator, if you're leading a nonprofit organization, if you're working in legislatures, like what are we doing to ensure that we're creating meaningful pathways for inclusion? And another aspect, and something that we can touch on in the discussion, is racism and misogyny in politics, especially directed towards women in power, but also those who are their political aides, staff, and that are in and around politics. You know, just me being a youth advisor, a position that I would say does not, and not to minimize the role I was in, but did not have much weight as compared to that of a politician. I was on the receiving end of vitriol and attack campaigns on Twitter. People have made videos in politics, and I even had a stalker at one point. And this story is not, you know, exclusive to a lot of people who have worked in politics. Like, I know a lot of women who have experienced this as well. And we really need to make sure that when we invite people to run, when we're thinking about ways to create environments that are safe, we're also thinking about every aspect of their life, including the online world, and what happens when they're not in the office or in the legislature as well, and their families, and supporting that aspect too. So what needs to change to reduce these barriers? I really think we need to prioritize anti-oppression in a way that is beyond statements. We need to really look at people as humans and see how real it is, the impacts that these power structures have, and how it disadvantages and oppresses people, and what that looks like in real life. And I think that can only happen when there are more of us at the table. And I think we really should look into mentorship opportunities that are, you know, sustainable and culturally appropriate as well. And when it comes to recruitment, I know we don't have parties at the municipal level, but there's organizations like Progress Toronto that are doing really incredible work as well. When it comes to recruitment, and when we're seeking out candidates, you know, to do the work and to recognize that, like, when we're looking at youth or racialized women, that we face a different reality and barriers to engagement than other peers. And we're working against a lot of harm that has been done. So I think we need to have more intentional and proactive efforts to get people to enter the political arena again and feel safe. And something that I saw at the provincial level, which having parties, is seeing, you know, women candidates being used as sacrificial lambs, especially when it came to Black women engaging in provincial politics, and seeing them being served as, like, you know, party stand bearers in districts that they had little chances to win. And I've even had friends who have been asked to run in ridings that were honestly like political suicide. And just seeing that when we do take a chance on folks, to give them the proper support and the attention and the space they need to succeed as well, and really investing in people in a proper way. And I really think that we do need a more representative democracy. The city is becoming unlivable for a lot of people. The cost of housing is driving communities out of the city, and cultural groups as well. And Toronto is really a shell without its racialized communities. We tout ourselves on diversity, but that requires doing the work to ensure that we're supporting the communities that make Toronto, Toronto. Settlement has been done poorly for decades. Racism seeps through our institutions, and we need to start taking the experiences of racialized people more serious in planning and politics. And that can only be done if we're at the table and if we have the power to influence decisions that impact policy, programs, and services. Through inclusive decision-making, I strongly believe that we all win, because together we create a city that meets the needs of everyone and not just a few groups. We really need to focus on recruiting racialized women and minorities and giving them the proper support to succeed from the beginning to the end. And we really need to create environments that support all experiences and not just that of a white man, which is what I've seen in many political spaces that I've been in. And if we fail to do this, we're failing ourselves by increasing disparity, conflict, and displacement within our communities and societies. Like Sahara said in the beginning, 52% of the city is racialized, and we are elected 4 city councilors that are racialized, and I think 1 Black man, and it's quite shameful. It shows that our leaders, it shows that we are at a time, a critical juncture where our leadership really needs to reflect the people it serves. And I don't think, I've been following the election, but the candidates in ridings, and I don't know if we're gonna have something different this time around. It doesn't look like it, but I really hope for the sake of the city and what it stands for, and you know, what we have at stake, that we can build that city. I really do think it's possible with a lot of intention and planning and all the good folks in this room.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Habon, for that wonderful talk. Really just loved, again, hearing that trajectory as we heard with Safeeya, you know, of being sort of politicized at a young age, and all the steps you took to get to where you are today. Some things that stood out to me is, yeah, I mean, the focus on lack of representation, particularly of Black women in politics. You know, I think it's something we've kind of all gotten very used to, and it's become sort of very normalized. But of course, there's no reason that this should be the case, and you know, a different sort of approach to politics is possible. Loved your focus on municipalities, right, as we approach these elections coming up, you know, in about 10 days. You know, underlining how important it is, and you know, it's probably the level of government that we interact with the most on a day-to-day basis, and yet it's where most people are disengaged. And just loved how you underlined what a critical juncture we're at, right? Just what an urgent moment this is. And just wanted to thank you as well for highlighting the issue of how we treat, you know, politicians from marginalized groups once they're in power, right? There's so often, you know, applause when someone from one of these communities, you know, wins an election or something, but people sort of lose focus after they've made it there, right? And there's not necessarily a focus on how they're treated, right? Whether it's on the campaign trail or in person or online, just some of the abuse that they experience. So so important to have that longer term perspective. So wonderful. Thank you so much for that, Habon. I think we're just past 11:30 right now, so we're going to move into to a moderated discussion where I'll be asking just a few questions of Safeeya and Habon, and we'll just kind of get into a conversation. We'll be doing that for about 10 or 15 minutes, and then we'll move on to some Q&A from all of the participants. So the question I wanted to start with is around risk. So, you know, I think we have a sense that electing, you know, well, electing people from marginalized communities, right, LGBTQ plus candidates, there's this sort of popular sense that there's something inherently sort of risky, right? And this is something different. This is really different from the status quo, and that white male politicians represent sort of a safer choice, right? And I think we're often not aware of the risk that is being represented when we continually elect the same kinds of people over and over again, right? So I guess I'd love to hear from you both about what is being risked, right? If we continually elect the politicians that don't, you know, represent the communities that elected them. Yeah, I'd just love to hear from both of you about your thoughts on that.
Okay, I'll be quick because I think I touched on some of this and all I said, but I really think that, you know, we don't elect leaders based on their competence, and if that was the case, you know, maybe we'd be looking at risk differently, but it's definitely not the case in politics. And I think we run the risk of having a city that creates policies, programs, and services that are harmful. So because, you know, I think we all have had the discussion of systemic racism. The summer of 2020 was hopefully a wake-up call for a lot of us. But even in the unconscious bias that we do have, without lived experience guiding a lot of the decision making, it's really hard to create solutions for people when you cannot A, empathize with them, and B, sometimes even in good faith, we have biases that come out. And it's not just the politicians, it's political aid, it's staff, it's people who hold power. I think it really needs to be more reflective. And when we have a diversity of lived experiences and identities at the table, I really believe we can bring stronger policy that pushes our city forward and makes us a city that we can be proud of. When we can have more discussions, debates internally, when candidates have good advisors and supports that can, you know, challenge their way of thinking, I think we can build better policy programs and services. And we run the risk of losing everything that the city stands for by driving people out. And obviously harming and killing people, like we've seen with the COVID-19 pandemic. So there's a lot at stake here. It's not a joke. These are people's lives. This is our community. These are loved ones, our families. This is the people that you work with, you go to school with. There's a lot at stake here.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And the importance of having people that can, diversify the perspective and really challenge politicians in the way that they think, and sort of challenge the business as usual approach to politics that we have. So crucial. I mean, I think especially in municipal politics, as Safeeya alluded to, very, very difficult to beat an incumbent, right? We tend to elect the same city councilors, over and over again. So important to be able to have folks that can challenge that perspective. Yeah, Safeeya.
Habon, you highlighted basically everything that I want to say. It's funny, Paul, that you say diversity of perspectives, because that was one of the main slogans of our campaign. And I tokenism for me was a huge thing I never really understood until I ran for office, until it was my face on the sign, which was another experience. But I wasn't thinking that was going to be part of the campaign. And then all of a sudden, all over social media and including Reddit, we were trending on Reddit. And it was, oh, brown girl runs who just wants to run and win because she's brown. Like, this is going crazy. Like, it's just, you run that risk when you're talking about risk, is that it's risky for the candidate too, like it's so hard to put yourself out there. And when you do put yourself out there, I don't know. I think everything that Habon mentioned, I had a friend recently who in her early 20s is now bound to a wheelchair. She's going to be in a wheelchair for the rest of her life. And just when I think about diversity of perspectives, I think about, now the lack of thought in city planning when it comes to accessibility. These are all things that you don't think about. It's just, you're walking the street, you go around living your day. But at the municipal level, if you don't have that diversity of perspectives, not just at the political level, but like Habon mentioned, in planning, in the advisors, everybody from the mayor all the way down, it's so important to have that diversity of perspectives, because it's people's lives at risk.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, folks can have all the goodwill in the world, but if the decision makers, the folks in power, haven't lived that experience, it's very difficult for them to empathize, right? And to be able to enact policies that are going to alleviate some of the suffering that people are experiencing. Absolutely. I also was interesting to hear about some of the comments you received on social media, because it kind of aligns with the next question I wanted to ask, which is about social media. So I mean, it's very challenging, right? Because social media has, on the one hand, obviously facilitated access to politicians in a way that is pretty unprecedented, in political history, right? You can tweet directly at your MP, you could, comment on their Facebook page or what have you, right? It's kind of reduced some of those barriers that we might have with our elected representatives. But of course, as you alluded to, and as we're all well aware, right, it's facilitated horrific abuse, right? Particularly for racialized women, right? So it's really challenging because it's facilitated access. It's made it easier for certain voices to enter politics and to mount campaigns, right? I'm thinking of someone like AOC, right, who relied really heavily on social media for her rise to power. But of course, it does have such an ugly kind of underbelly. I just would love to hear your take on. It's a big question, right? We've talked a lot about it over the past few years, but to your mind, has social media on net really been a good or bad thing in the fight for a more diverse politics? I mean, it's a big question, and I probably won't solve it today, but I'd just love to hear your thoughts on it.
I think that social media it can be used in a beneficial tool. Without it, we wouldn't have been able to have the 400 army that we had. It was amazing to have so many young people to join, and trending on social media also was helpful for sure, and brought in some donations. But at the end of the day, you don't have control over the narrative, and things kind of take their own a beast of its own. So it's very bittersweet. I mean, I feel like this is a topic that can be discussed for hours and hours. And I think that for me, you know, having AOC, for example, when I was running, she'd just run right before. And so seeing her on social media, seeing her campaign and being able to follow it that closely was really, really inspiring for me. So I think it can be used in such an amazing tool. Yeah, I don't know. What do you think, Habon? I feel very bittersweet about it.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. I think like there's good and bad to it, and it affects people in all sectors, not just politics, civil society, not like, you know, it affects us all. And like, I think for me, it gives me hope sometimes, especially when I was in the political space, to know that there's incredible women who are in the same situations that I was in, or in positions of power, like Safeeya, like Sahar, and working to increase, you know, civic engagement of all of our communities. It connects me to people that that I probably would never have the chance to connect to if I didn't have it. But it also, the ugly side of it is not fun. And I remember the first time that I was on the receiving end. I'm not going to name, but someone in a really powerful position in the Canadian media scene had called me an Islamist hijabi, because I'd interviewed the prime minister at an Islamic conference, and I was questioning him on the trends of Islamophobia we were seeing across the country. And I remember like seeing that tweet and seeing like 800 people like it and like a couple hundred retweets. And it was my community at the end of the day on Twitter that came and defended me and supported me. But for a long time, I didn't feel safe. And you start to question whether you're really supposed to be in spaces. Like, it's a really scary experience. And since then, other incidences have happened, and I have a better way of dealing with it. And I have a safety plan and things that I can consider for myself to be safe online. But it really emboldens people to say things that they probably wouldn't say to your face, and to direct aggression towards you. And we know sometimes that can translate to real life harm. So it's definitely scary, but I think it's a factor in our lives right now, and social media is here to stay. And it's definitely safety online and how we can protect those in the public eye is something that I think a lot of people are thinking and considering, and we need to give more importance to, especially politicians at all levels.
And just on that, I feel that it can also exacerbate things like imposter syndrome. It's so hard in and of itself to be a person of, you know, be from a racialized community, young person in these positions, because you're putting yourself out there in that, you know, typically status quo white male space. And then you see this online, it just exacerbates that. And I think it can be really harmful to other people looking and seeing, okay, well, I don't want to do that because that looks scary.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Right. It's like with all discussions around social media, there's so many different factors, and it's just such a mixed bag, right, in terms of people's experiences with it. But I really want to thank you both for sharing those experiences, as challenging as they were, I'm sure, to share, and really inspiring too to hear that despite, you know, this sort of abuse that you faced and the barriers that were caused by it, it didn't stop you, right? And you are here where you are. You're here today, and continuing in this journey of civic engagement, right? So it's really inspiring to hear that people were that, you know, you sort of move past the abuse that was suffered. I guess, you know, another barrier that's talked a lot about, and I know Safeeya, you alluded to it during your presentation, was around money. There's no simple answer here, right? But I'm interested to hear your thoughts on the role that money plays in limiting access to politics for marginalized groups, and if there are any solutions that could exist. I mean, I know campaign finance reforms could have a role, but at the same time, right, it's not going to stop the fact that typically the people that are able to mount campaigns and, you know, have the time available to do it and the resources and stuff typically are wealthy people, right? And campaign finance reforms might not be able to change that. So I'm just wondering if you could touch on the role that money has played in both of your journeys, right, in civic engagement and the barriers that's caused.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of young people or a lot of racialized people coming into this game come from communities that don't have this wealth built up, you know, and it's it comes from, it's two-pronged. It's like you go in the space and you're asking for funding, but again, people like you don't historically ask for funding. So it's taboo, but then also the communities you come from, because of the politicians who've been in place and because of the policy that's been in place, hasn't had the opportunity and the same resources to build that wealth so that you can have community backing. It kind of is this cyclical thing. So yeah, I mean, funding is really important. I mean, at the municipal level, it's still very much a sign game. And I'm sure a lot of folks who, you know, you know what I'm talking about. There's you go and you vote for your mayor, but again, you have so many candidates. When I was running, there were 9 candidates to choose from. I mean, that's a lot of platforms to read. And a lot of the communities who, you know, I'm addressing, like, they're still focused on surviving. I mean, you have to take the time out of your day and out of your life to go and read all these platforms. It's exhausting, it's a lot, and it's overwhelming. So, you know, funding is very, very important. And at the end of the day, people will go and vote for their mayor, and whatever signs they see the most, they just circle that one sometimes. And I've had many conversations like that before. And that's true at the ground level. Like, you know, it's nice, we're all here discussing, you know, it's important for platforms, important for funding, it's important for whatever, but like people from their day to day, a lot of the folks who, especially the folks that we're addressing, it's hard enough, you know. So funding is a very, very important and real barrier. And I don't know what the solution is, because at the municipal level, we don't have that party machine. And so sometimes I think maybe it would be helpful to have that financial backing, but also, it's what I love about municipal politics is that you as an individual can come in and have these policy platforms, this platform, based on what you feel that your community needs. So it's a double-edged sword, that one.
I'm sorry, it's almost midnight here, so if my thoughts are a little incoherent, I do apologize. But and also 2 things when it comes to money, I think I'll talk about the individuals that I've come across, like racialized women who want to run for politics, as well as like the importance of having a different class lens in the political space. So I think when I look to like women who in my life have told me that they want to run, Black women, I have no political aspirations. I think I would support the political process, but after seeing it firsthand, it's definitely not something I can see for myself. But when I turn to like the women in my life that tell me that they want to run eventually, especially Black women, I see themselves putting them through law school, getting multiple degrees, working various jobs, and like really backing on their education to prove to the public that there's someone that can be trusted. So I think these are some of the impacts that and we know education is not affordable, changes to OSAP. We see what a lot of young people are facing in our province. But when I hear about a young racialized person who has political aspirations, the things that they do to set themselves up for success, even knowing that at that point they might not be taken seriously, is really sad. It shows that who sees themselves as a valid stakeholder and actor in our democracy and our political process. And I think it's something that really needs to change, because we need all perspectives at the table. And when I think about, you know, myself growing up in a low-income community and experiencing poverty, and then going to working with politicians at like the federal and provincial level, and seeing that a lot of them don't have a sense of what it's like to be poor, and see people who are poor as charity and not as, you know, people that they should serve and like govern just like everybody else. So I really think we do need to do a lot more work to get people with different experiences, especially when it comes to experiences of poverty and knowing what it's like to experience hardship in leadership positions, because it does make an impact. And yeah, some of the conversations at the policy table about poverty, I felt myself getting so frustrated, because it's just seen as like charity and food banks, but we're not seeing for people as people. And I think we lose out a lot by not having that perspective at the table as well.
Thank you, Habon. Well, if that's your thoughts being incoherent, then that's very impressive, because thank you so much for those great responses, both of you. I really loved both of your focus on the fact that there's so many sort of dimensions, right, to money as a barrier, right? So often the focus is on just like campaign finance, right? What are the limitations on the amount that people can donate? But obviously poverty and privilege, I mean, it's just such a multi-dimensional game, right? That really limits people's access to some of these spaces from such a young age, right? And I think so often the focus is very narrowly on really just the immediate, like, you know, how much money does someone have for a campaign, right? When of course it's much bigger than that. So yeah, I'd love to switch the conversation over to some Q&A from participants. I know I just wrote in the chat. If people would like to go ahead and just type any questions for our panelists into the chat, you are more than welcome to now. I know it might take a second for those to percolate a little bit after such an insightful discussion, but if you have questions, please go ahead and put them in the chat. Or you can raise your hand too. Bruna, I see Bruna has your hand up. Go ahead, Bruna.
Yes, thank you so much. Hearing your stories and you taking this time today is very inspiring. I have a question that maybe is a little bit outside of what we've been discussing. So I work mainly with newcomer women and young women who aren't able to vote or run for elections, and yet would still like to be involved. And I was just wondering if you had any thoughts about, you know, how these folks could get their messages across and how they can get involved with these issues that do affect them on a day-to-day life, for their day-to-day life. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, there are, as somebody who had a team, I would say a huge portion of our team couldn't vote or couldn't, you know, they weren't citizens yet. So it was great to have those folks on the team. It gives the campaign also that diversity of perspectives. And so that could be something that maybe they would want to get involved with. But again, I like to say that the civic engagement process the political part is just one aspect of it. You know, there's so many organizations doing amazing work like Habon with Apathy is Boring. And there's so many wonderful organizations. I'm happy to send you a list, and maybe Habon, I'll ask you too if there's any other organizations, but there's about 5 or 6 that I can think of off the top of my head. And I'm happy to share those with you offline.
Happy to add to the list, but that's a really good question. Yeah.
That's a great question.
Thank you. I see another question that's come in here. So thank you, Safeeya and Habon, for sharing your experiences with us. If you feel comfortable sharing, how do you deal with feelings of frustration? Everybody in this space is obviously so willing to listen and learn, but sometimes it can be so much emotional labor when people are resistant. It's a great question.
I guess I can quickly add to this. I think for me, I didn't know how to deal with it in the beginning, and that's perfectly okay. I think we're used to experiencing the feelings of exclusion in a lot of spaces, but when it comes to like entering the workplace for the first time or being in political spaces, there's an added level of like frustration, and it can be harmful. Like I think this can even be equated to like some of the experiences in academia. I think especially coming from the perspective of a racialized woman, like it can be really frustrating. And the best piece of advice I could give you is something one of my good friends told me. And we just come out of like a political discussion with a politician, and we were talking about gun violence, and I felt very frustrated because the politician I was speaking to did not see it as an issue and thought that it was like a lifestyle that kids chose. But it was an issue I experienced in the community from a very young age, and I knew that it wasn't a matter of choice, but of economic disparity and inclusion and poverty and all exclusion, and the impacts that it had on like the family unit and young people and their self-esteem and community and friendship and connection. And there's so many things that go into like youth violence, but it just wasn't being conveyed in the discussion that we had. And she told me, Habon, your job is not to solve these issues. You're on this earth for a limited time. You plant the seed. the seed grows into a tree. You might not live to see that tree grow, but you can be in its shade, and your kids will be in its shade, or their kids will benefit from the progress that you've pushed for and that people before you have pushed for as well. So just knowing that you're not responsible for solving systems of oppression and the impact that it has on your life, and you're human and you're one person, and get connected to communities and wonderful people who inspire you. Like for me, I have a great group of friends that support me, but I'm also connected to community groups that I know that when I can rest, they'll be doing the work as well. And you really need to take care of your mental health in this process as well, because when you're connected to the issues that you're advocating for and talking about, you know, it's a lot more personal and you're connected to it, and it takes a huge emotional and mental toll. And it can even take a physical toll as well. So just to take care of yourself and to know that like there will be progress, even if it's slow at times.
Yeah, I think I want to be very, very transparent with what happened to me after running. You know, the hardest part and the most frustrating part was the silencing. You know, I'm sure a lot of racialized people feel this way, is you're given the spotlight because you're a racialized person, and you know you might be on the front of a brochure or the front of a website, but then when it actually comes down to the real work, you're silenced, and that is the hardest and most frustrating part of it all. You know, to be transparent, I burnt out really, really hard after our campaign, and it took me a long time to recover, a few months. So I think it's important to share those side of things as well, because you know, putting yourself out there has real world consequences to the person and the people behind the screens, and it wasn't easy, but I think it's something that we're it's an ongoing process, like Habon mentioned, and I wasn't great at it at the beginning. But, you know, I think about my ancestors, I think about all of the people that have moved and pushed things forward to be where I am today. And hopefully, and that's what I tell myself, is hopefully I can push and, you know, do some work so that the next generation has more opportunities than I did. That's what I tell myself.
Thank you so much, Safeeya. I think that's a great note to close on. And for our closing, I'll pass it over to my colleague Sahar.
Hi all, I will be super quick because we're at 11:59, but thank you so much. There was so much rich content that you both shared. Habon and Safeeya, you were both so vulnerable and open about your experiences, so thank you for trusting this Zoom room with all of those experiences and sharing that with us. We heard a lot about barriers, about tokenism, lack of diversity, and how it doesn't connect to on-the-ground realities of the communities that you're both a part of. The importance of lived experience so that elected officials can create policies that alleviate problems for the most vulnerable. We talked about the scary side of politics, especially on social media, and some of the very upsetting experiences that both of you have been through. And also about how racialized candidates, and I've heard this many times before, need to focus on their credentials to prove legitimacy and earn validation for why they're there or why they deserve to earn a vote or even show up at somebody's door. So thank you for sharing that. At the same time, I also heard a lot of hope and a lot of inspirational messages through your experiences as well. Safeeya, you spoke to how having someone as AOC was so inspiring during your campaign. And as someone who watched your campaign, I feel like you were the Mississauga AOC for so many of us, because it was so inspiring to see a very young person like throw their hat in the ring. We all know the barriers that are there, and you know, everything that we talked about. And so and same with Habon, you know, interviewing the Prime Minister, that is so inspiring for all of us that are watching you. So you two finding each other through this work, the impact that you have on your communities and all of the people that look up to you, and the impact that you'll have on the next generation, even if it's bit by bit and in these small ways, is incredibly important. So, you know, there's a lot of barriers, but in the two of you, I also see a lot of inspiration and hope. So thank you for joining us. Paul has put up a slide with ways to stay connected to our project. Since we're talking about municipal elections, I learned this morning actually that the first, I know not everyone here is in Toronto, City of Toronto, but the first Toronto mayoral debate is actually happening right now at 12 p.m. So this is the very first major mayor's debate. So it's, maybe you want to tune in. It will be focused on seniors, which is somewhat the opposite of today's topic. But anyways, I'll put that link in the chat if you want to check it out. And yeah, thank you. Thank you so much and have a great day.
Thanks all.
Thank you so much for organizing.
Have a great day, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Take care, everyone.